I appreciate you supporting this video and joining me as we continue our study in the Gospel of Matthew. I am going to be reading from the American Standard Version of the New Testament, the story of Matthew chapter 22 and verses 1 to 3. The American Standard Version is a revision of the King James Version whose roots go back to the 19th century. Now, we know today that if you go into any bookstore that sells Bibles, or you go online, or you go to an online site to get a translation, there is a plethora of English translations. The great explosion of translations is basically mid 20th century forward. But even still said, there were all through the 20th century a number of English translations as an attempt to provide the scripture in more modern English and more modern sensibility. The problem, of course, was that the King James Version came to dominate the church scene and the English speaking scene for more than 3 centuries. And it became very, very difficult to say, you know what, we need to replace this revered and beloved classic with something more modern. And I say this to say this, the American Standard Version represents the first serious and real attempt to provide a up-to-date translation of the King James Version. This version was actually preceded by a British version, but it's out of the same pool that these two translations came out, a 19th century attempt to provide a modernized revision of the King James Version. Matthew chapter 23 and verses 1 to 3. Then spake Jesus to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. All things, therefore, whatsoever they bid you, these do and observe. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. And as an aside, while this was an attempt to be a more modern English translation, the American Standard Version basically just fell flat on its face. It did some revision work, but ultimately it fails because it was not, well, modern enough. In the medieval period of Europe, and in particular in what we now call France, there emerged the group known as the Cathars. The Cathars were a people who held to a dualistic worldview. Dualism is not Christian and it has never been Christian. And I throw out that because unfortunately dualism is kind of one of those repeating sins of the church that seem to come back again and again throughout church history. Dualism is the belief that there are two equal and opposing forces in the universe. One is good and one is evil. In this view, the material world is evil. This then leads to the idea that, for example, sexuality in its practice is always wrong. The Cathars rise to prominence for about 2 centuries centered in France, spilling over into places like Italy and so on and so forth. In their view, the Cathars are noted for how they had two types of adherents. They had those that were known as the perfects and the more rank and file. The perfect among the Cathars were the ones who were really serious about the faith and movement and upheld the standards and the rules of the belief system. Now, in that, we find one of the reasons why the Cathars were successful for a time and season until the society around them bludgeoned them to death, because the Cathars upheld standards of practice that were far better than the church in that time, and we're thinking in particular of the priesthood. There was therefore in this movement two tiers of believers. There was also room in the movement for those who did not embrace the higher standards of the perfect. Now, the Cathar movement was clearly heretical. It was clearly not Christian. The Christian church has not avoided one of the problems that you found within the Kafar movement, and one of the fundamental mistakes of the church has always been this attempt to gravitate towards, as it were, two standards of Christian belief and practice. So, for example, if we went back to the Sermon on the Mount, one of the ways we can interpret it is that this is the gold standard for Christian living, which is above and beyond the average person. It's there, but you know what? Only a select few are able to live up to it. And this, of course, is one of the problems that would plague the monastic movement. Now, to say this is not to say that this was the intent of the monastic movement, but in terms of its practices, especially as you move from medieval Christendom and Europe, is that the monastic movement became, as it were, the gold standard of Christian living. You had the rank and file people who were Christian, and in medieval Europe, basically anybody who showed up at a church was considered Christian. And then you had the monks who were the really serious, or the nuns who were the really serious Christians. And if you were really serious about being a Christian, well, you joined one of the religious orders. Now, when we look at the Pharisees in the first century, unfortunately, as a movement, also fall into this trap, which is the practice that there is the rank and file believers, and then there is the gold standards. Now, when that is said and done, this was not the intent of the Pharisees, but it was the practical outworking of it. In the same way, that is what happened to the monastic movement, and in a sense, that's what happened in the Kafar movement. Jesus in Matthew chapter 23 and verses 1 to 3 says that the Pharisees created a system that did not provide freedom and grace. They created a system in which there were rules for everything. If you embrace these rules, you are, well, an elite believer. Legalism is a danger in the church. Legalism creates standards of faith and conduct that not all believers can actually fulfill. But often those standards are impossible to fulfill in the practice of everyday life and living. You know, one of the problems with the Kafar movement is, and you know, some of these movements don't quite think things out. If the practice of sexuality is evil, you know what? You basically shot yourself in the foot as a movement, because if you don't create new little followers of your movement, guess what? You eventually die out. And the Kafars, and there are some movements within the United States in the 19th century that lived in communities that also ran into this problem. Go back to the Kafars for a moment, and what you had is people who were exalted because they were able to fulfill the more difficult way. This is partly why the Kafar movement for a while gave the church a run for its money in that part of the world at that time. Legalism inevitably moves down the road to a two-tier Christian standard, the gold standard and the rank and file. Now, we can turn around and look at the evangelical church in the late 20th century or first part of the 21st century and say that we have not fallen into this trap. We are that much better than they were. But let me give you an example of how legalism creeps into the church, and not always by the front door, but sometimes through the back door. If you look at evangelicals, what do we praise and exalt above all else? Well, okay, maybe a little bit extreme in saying this, but it's the work and practice of Christian missions. We have centered out the work of missions as being extremely important. We have created a system where people who do the work of missions are godly. Missions has come too often to be defined by work done in a place that you have to travel a great distance to. Now, when you look at this, what you discover and what you find missing in all of this is obedience to Jesus Christ. And missions in that sense, as its practice, can become as much a form of legalism, because it becomes a set of rules of how to live the Christian life. And what you are to do is to fulfill this rule and to fulfill this practice. And what gets lost in the shuffle is the need to be obedient to the call of God on our life. The adulation of missions has come at the expense of personal consecration and commitment to Him. It is a form of legalism. Missions is not all important. Yes, it is important. It is important for the church to reach out. But what is all important is that I do my will. And if that means I never leave my neighborhood, that's fine according to God.